Hi, my name is Amanda Gustin, and I'm the Director of Collections and Access at the Vermont Historical Society. I'm here with you today to share a style of sculpture that you may have seen around. There were a lot of these produced. This is what we call, in the museum business and outside, a Rogers group. Group is obvious. The Rogers comes from sculptor John Rogers, who was born in Salem, Massachusetts in 1829. Now, he was born into a merchant family that had a generation or so before been extremely well off, but by the time he was born, the money was mostly gone. And even though he wanted to be an artist from a young age, his parents were not at all in favor of that, and they sent him off to train as a machinist. So he trained and worked as a machinist in Manchester, New Hampshire, in the mills there for a number of years, and then he moved west to work as a railroad mechanic in Missouri. Now, in 1857, there was a huge financial crash and a depression, and railroad work in his area kind of dried up. So he returned back to Massachusetts and he decided it was finally time. He'd been playing with some artistic pursuits the whole time in the background. He'd always loved sculpting in clay. But in the late 1850s, he finally decided this is the moment, I'm going to try to make it as an artist, and he succeeded. In 1859, he produced the first sculpture in a style that would become his. This style you can see here, it's a very realistic style, and he often, but not always, focused on scenes of everyday life. So the sculpture we have today, commonly called Checkers up at the farm, you can see these people are posed and they're acting just as if you would come across them in the middle of their action. And that's extremely typical for a Rogers group. Rogers really liked to start his work in clay, from which he would produce a bronze. Now, the sculpture that we have in front of us, and the vast majority of all the Rogers group sculptures, are actually plaster. Historians believe this is for a couple of reasons. One, plaster is cheaper and easier to work with. And two, it can be replicated on large scale. So what Rogers actually did is he would eventually create a model in bronze that would then have a cast or a mold created of it that would then be cast in plaster and painted for the final sculpture group. Now, some people believe another reason that he ended up doing most of his sculptures in plaster is because it becomes much more affordable. What Rogers was really doing, and the real genius of his marketing, in addition to his art, is that he is making this art accessible and popular with a much broader range of people than had previously collected art in America. A Rogers group would have sold for on average $15 in the mid to late 19th century, which works out to about $500 today. So these are affordable status symbols. It became the thing to have a Rogers group or more in your living room, to give them as splashy gifts. In fact, a lot of new Rogers group sculptures, and eventually he made almost 80 of them. They would debut just before the June wedding season and just before the Christmas shopping season, and you would find out about them in a catalog and order them for your own home. Rogers really worked from about that 1859 date until about the 1890s. He had about 30 years of, and I can't emphasize this enough, like absolute smash hit popularity. As I said, there were almost 80,000 of these produced. Tens of thousands of them, some more than others. This one we have here, Checkers Up at the Farm, was absolutely one of the most popular scenes. Most of them were everyday life, but sometimes he would do scenes from history. You may have seen he did a whole series of scenes from Civil War, and he also did sometimes scenes from literature. He did a whole Shakespearean series, for example. The success of his sculpture business, and really of the production business, he had an entire factory turning these out at the peak of his popularity, made him a millionaire by the end of his life. But as I said, these were kind of a fad. They had a rise and a fall. So by the time he passed away in 1904, he was no longer actively sculpting or marketing his sculptures, and he died not in obscurity, but much lesser known than he had been at the peak of his popularity. Today, you can find Rogers groups, I would venture to guess, in most museums in the United States. This is one of the Vermont Historical Society's holdings of Rogers groups. And it's interesting in a couple of ways. It shows that it was sort of loved and kept out in someone's space. And also, in museums, we kind of love when something is a little bit damaged because you can see how it was made. You can see down here the hoe The plaster has chipped off, and you can see the metal armature that is underneath this sculpture, providing some of the base for the plaster to be on. Thank you for joining us today. To learn more about the Vermont Historical Society, you can visit us at vermonthistory.org or follow us on social media.